Matt Ridley, thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello, first of all, Matt Ridley, and thank you so much for being with us for this interview about a wonderful book and a very inspiring one, and with a lot of things that I would never thought about, to be honest.
Thank you. Well, that's very nice of you to say. It's very nice to be with you in Romania. I'm sorry that we're having to do it virtually.
Yes, we are hoping for better times when you will come to Romania, hopefully, and we'll have another chat. But now we are taking the advantages of being online, of this technology, of having this technology, who somebody invented, or is the result of an innovation?
It is a very important innovation, video conferencing. It's one that was around before the pandemic, but relatively few people had access to it. And so it didn't become, it was the pandemic that caused us all to begin to use it. I don't think I remember people saying to me, "Are you on Zoom?" 2 years ago, but now it's a routine question that we ask. So it's a case of how the pandemic has brought forward the use of a technology rather than the invention of it. It wasn't invented during the pandemic. It was innovated during it.
But before this, we had Skype, so more or less similar technology. We use it, but not to that extent, of course, because we are not forced. So one of the
questions, it's worth thinking about what would have happened if the pandemic had happened 10 years ago. We wouldn't have been able to continue business online to the same extent. We wouldn't have had Skype. We wouldn't have, well, there was Skype, but only just. There wasn't broadband. There wasn't internet delivery. There wasn't Amazon, you know. So actually, we could not have locked down society 10 years ago. And 10 years after this, we'd probably have instant vaccines and it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I don't want to wait 10 years to come another pandemics to see what will happen. So let's stay with this one. Let's finish this one.
Right.
But there is an important point here. So the pandemics forced us to innovate, yes, to use this technology, to try to get the best of it. So one of the question is innovation, how to say, dependent on, how to say, serious situations we are in? We have to be forced to innovate?
I don't think so, because yes, it's true that in this case, the pandemic has brought forward innovations like video conferencing and messenger RNA vaccines. And to some extent, war does the same, the invention of radar during war and so on. But I don't believe that crises are the main drivers of innovation. I don't think history teaches that lesson. There's a lot of innovation happens in peaceful times, in wealthy places, in prosperous societies. The Bay Area of San Francisco, the Silicon Valley area has been a huge engine of innovation in the last 50 years, and it's not been a place of crisis on the whole. And if you look at technologies like computing, it may appear that the Second World War accelerated the development of computing, but in my book, I argue that's not the case, actually, that it would have developed even faster without the war, because it was already in the late 1930s, the development of computing was already accelerating, and then it became secret, and that actually prevented it being developed faster than it would have been.
So in a way, still people were forced, yes, to use it, like we were now forced to, how to say, to accelerate the research and the use of mRNA, the vaccine that is using this technology.
Yeah, the mRNA vaccine technology may be one of the most important innovations of recent years. I think it's a very exciting technology because it enables us to develop a vaccine very fast, very safely. Once we've developed this technique for one vaccine, it's almost certainly just as safe for another vaccine, and to essentially reprogram vaccines very quickly for new diseases. So this is the breakthrough technology for vaccines that we have been waiting for a very long time. Until the beginning of the pandemic, vaccines took many years to develop, and there had been no acceleration in the development of them, and they were very uncertain. They often didn't work. I write in the book about the development of a whooping cough vaccine in the 1930s in 4 years, which was good, which would be good going even in this century. And so I think this is an exciting technology, but it's worth remembering that it wouldn't exist if somebody from Hungary by the name of Katalin Karikó had not gone to the United States, begun work on the idea of a messenger RNA vaccine for cancer, not for infectious disease, and had spent 20 years trying to develop this technology, often failing, losing her grants, being demoted from her positions because she couldn't make it work, and then eventually beginning to make it work with the help of somebody called Drew Weissman. When we see breakthroughs happening as a result of a crisis, or even not as a result of a crisis, we sometimes forget that there's 20 years of steady preparation by someone, often unappreciated, before it's possible to have that innovation. So one of the things I like to emphasize is that innovation is, in that sense, a more gradual process than we think. We see the big breakthrough, but we forget about the long preparation.
Yeah, maybe this is a way of people who are fearing about everything that's innovation or innovative to understand this, because one of the arguments these days against this kind of vaccine is that, oops, it appeared so suddenly, too quickly. It's unsure. People are forgetting that, like you've said, there are years behind spent in research, failures, trials, failures, success. So this is the way science is working, and maybe here is something we should try to do best to explain how science works and innovation.
Yes, I think that's very important. It's very important to get across the concept of trial and error being an important part of innovation. Now, obviously, you don't want big errors in vaccines or big errors in nuclear power or something like that. You know, you have to be careful not to cause problems when you're doing innovation. But on the other hand, it is important to remind people that failure is not a failure. That if you fail many times, it doesn't mean you won't eventually succeed. If you look at the history of a company like Amazon, it had many failures on the way to being a great success. Trial and error is an important part of developing technologies, and I think that's something that we very much have to get used to.
You write in your book, and I have your book here to show to the people who are watching us. So you write in your book that failure is a necessary ingredient of success.
Yes, I think this is a very important lesson. When I started exploring stories of innovation, whether 100 years ago or just a few years ago, again and again, I came across the same point that a lot of great innovators say you don't get it right first time. You have to keep trying different things. You have to keep changing direction. You have to look out for lucky chances. And if you do that, you will succeed. Whereas if you expect to get it right first time and to solve the problem right at the beginning, then you will fail. There's a very nice example of this, a story I tell in the book about the invention of the aeroplane. In 1903, a man named Samuel Langley, who was a brilliant astronomer, very well connected, politically a successful person, head of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He said to the US government, give me a large grant and I will invent an aeroplane. And they gave him an enormous grant for the time. And he went off and did it in secret because he was so clever, there was no point in talking to anybody else. And his aeroplane splashed straight into the river without getting into the air. And 10 days later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who did not have a degree between them, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, succeeded where Langley had failed. And what they had done over the preceding 5 or 6 years was experiment after experiment with gliders, with kites, with wind tunnels, again and again, trying different designs, practically testing things that, and they had a big failure. They 1 year their gliders wouldn't work, and it was because they were relying on information from somebody else about the exact ratio of the height to the width of a wing, and it turned out to be bad advice. It should have been more narrow and less wide, and so they knew that the way they were going to get into the air was not by being cleverer than everybody else, but by trying and failing more times. And I think this is a very important lesson. And by the way, it democratizes innovation. It means that any of us can do it. All you've got to do is persevere and persist and keep trying things. You don't have to be cleverer than the next person. You just have to work harder.
Yeah, but this doesn't mean that any one of us can be innovator, can innovate something.
Why not?
I don't know.
I think you could be a great innovator.
I'm just thinking, do we need a gene to become innovators?
Well, I think not. And I think that we have been misleading people in this respect for quite a long time, because we tell stories about brilliant people who did incredible innovations that changed the world, and we build a statue about them, and we give them a Nobel Prize, and we make them sound amazingly important. And we then tell children that it's important to be creative. And we use this word creativity. And I think that people hear that word and they think special juice, special inherent genes that you have to have, that only creative people can invent things. And I don't think that's right. I think that the story of the Wright brothers or Thomas Edison or Jeff Bezos is the story of people who were very determined, not prepared to give up when they had a failure, very keen to learn from their mistakes and to keep trying. I don't think it is a story of being creative in the sense of being a sort of special person. So I think we're misleading young people by making it sound like you have to be special to be an innovator. I don't think you do have to be special.
Maybe this is the failure of the educational systems who are not encouraging pupils, young people, kids to be free enough to innovate,
Well, I think free is a good word there, because I think we often talk about the way in which education teaches you what is known, what is not known, rather than not what is not known, and how it tells it removes your originality, makes you more like everybody else, and that is, I think, a mistake. I think to encourage eccentricity and difference and experiment and open-mindedness is very important. One of the things I've often argued is that when we teach people science, we tend to teach it as a catalogue of facts. This is Newton's law, this is Ohm's law, this is the way the world works. We've explained this, we've explained that. But I think we should start with the stuff we haven't explained yet. We don't know whether there are extraterrestrial civilizations. We don't know what the dark matter of the universe is. We don't know how life began. There are lots of mysteries out there, and science is in the business of tackling mysteries. It's not in the business of piling up catalogues of facts.
Yeah, and maybe we should not punish failures. We should change this culture of punishing the ones who are mistaken, and of course, in a general way.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, that Silicon Valley gets this right on the whole. If you go to a venture capitalist and you say, I've started 2 companies, they've both failed, but I learned a lot from them. A Silicon Valley venture capitalist will say, good, I think that you're the right person to back this time, because I think you probably learned enough from your mistakes, and this one's a good idea. But most of the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, the venture capitalist will say, well, if you failed twice, I'm not interested in supporting you at your third attempt. So I think tolerance of failure and the fact that people who failed at something are often the very best people to ask about that topic because they've learned what not to do, what can go wrong, etc. And they would do it much better second time around. Obviously, you can't take that to extreme. You can't say, I'm only going to invest in businesses by people who failed in business. That would be a mistake. But we do, I think, need to learn the importance of small failures as the route to success.
But you also need a kind, a special kind of environment, how Silicon Valley is. Because, for example, Silicon Valley faced the dot-com crisis. So everything went down, all the dot-coms, it was a kind of inflation of innovation then, and then everything went down. So there are lessons to be learned, but still the environment is built in that way that, okay, we are going down, but we will rise again, maybe in different ways. This is a way of helping us to innovate in the way we have to innovate.
That's exactly right. So in innovation in public policy to support innovation in technology is a crucial question for politicians. And for me, the main theme of such policies would be freedom. That is to say, if you set up a system in which people are free to invest, free to invent, free to change their mind, free to change direction, free to try something quickly and see if it works, and of course free as consumers to express your interest in a technology or not. These kinds of freedom are absolutely fundamental to the way Silicon Valley has worked, and they're fundamental to the way previous innovative societies have worked, whether it's Renaissance Italy or ancient Greece. Of course, not everybody was free in such societies, but they were a lot more free than they were in, say, the Ottoman Empire or the Ming Empire in China, where people were not free to express these ideas and try these different things. So I do think that the policy ingredient is essentially one of as much freedom as possible. In fact, in my book, I argue that this explains China's rise in recent decades.
Exactly, China is the example. Okay. Is the example I wanted you to focus on, because it's a very interesting example. Because it's not a free country like the US or the rest of the Western societies. Still, China, it counts a lot of innovation today.
Yeah. How do I explain that? Most people explain China's rise by saying, so actually being a strong government and setting out on a mission and a direction to tell society how to innovate is obviously works, because it's worked in China. I think that's the wrong lesson. I think the right lesson is that what happened under Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago was that he said, you're not free politically. If you want to set up a new political party, I'll put you in jail. But you are free economically. If you want to start a business or you want to invent a new widget, then you can do so very quickly with very little permission. You don't need permission from the local government, from the regulatory authorities. You're off to the races very quickly with your idea, as long as it's not a new political party or something like that. So the economic freedom of the entrepreneur in China has been pretty remarkable compared with in the West, where if you set up a business, you have to get permission from this person and that person, and it takes 3 months or 6 months, and it's very expensive, and you have to hire lawyers and all that kind of thing. So that has been why China has been innovative in the last 40 years. I don't think that's continuing. I think we are seeing under Xi Jinping now a much more authoritarian regime economically as well as politically, and that we are starting to see the engine of innovation in China will suffer as a result. something like this transition happened in China before, I think. Under the Song emperors, about 1,000 years ago, China was extremely innovative. This was the time when it developed gunpowder and the compass and the printing press and all of these technologies that came long before they were developed in Europe. And then after a Mongol interregnum, there came the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty was much more centralized. The Song Dynasty was very decentralized. Essentially, merchants were left free to do their own thing. And the Ming Dynasty said you can't trade with foreigners, you can't leave your hometown without permission, all these kind of things, which made it much harder to be an innovative society. And China stifled innovation and became much less prosperous as a result.
So China is not, learning from its own history?
I think so. I think it did learn from its history under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah,
but I think under Xi Jinping, it is not.
Mm-hmm. But it's not this paradoxically, because it's a time when everybody is rushing, to get new things, to innovate in order to, to compete better in this economic, in the end, run.
Well, yes, you say that, but if you look at what politicians in Europe or America talk about, they say we must have more innovation. Innovation's a good thing. And then they spend 90% of their time talking about how to redistribute tax money, how to regulate people, how to tell people what to do, what not to do, how to start wars or stop wars. The topic of innovation gets brief support and then very little interest from most governments. So actually, it's one of those things that we think we're supporting, but we don't do a lot of work in Western societies to think about how to generate more innovation.
Well, maybe because we take for granted that innovation is everywhere, it will come anyhow. So correct. Why bother? Speaking about
I think that is the problem. I think we do take innovation for granted, and we shouldn't, because there's some evidence that it's slowing down, that actually we're experiencing an innovation famine. If you leave the digital economy to one side, this has not been a very innovative last 50 years. We've not managed to improve transport or energy technologies very much at all. Sure, we've made airplanes safer, and we've made and cars have more cup holders in them, but they're not really radically transformed. And the same is true of a lot of our basic technologies. We've run out of ways of changing them. We're spending all our time inventing new video games and social media platforms, but we're not inventing, new forms of plumbing or new forms of building or all of these different things, which we could be doing. So I think we need to worry about how much we take for granted that innovation will happen, and it might not.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to point out that one of the chapters of your book, chapter number 9, is about the economics of innovation. A lot of lessons here. Somebody that will hopefully make people happy. The innovation does not create jobless situations. You will not lose your job because of innovation. On the contrary, actually. So innovation cannot be imposed. So that means that a society can stay resistant to innovation. Do we afford this?
Well, sorry, just on the question of jobs, it's important to say that, of course, a new technology can cause the loss of some jobs, but overall, it will create more jobs in another area, and we've found that again and again.
And
but whether or not,
and it can transform some jobs in some other kind of jobs, which also include a little bit of innovation.
Yeah, and I think we're misreading artificial intelligence. If we talk about it replacing people, we should talk about it augmenting people. It will, a doctor who is trying to diagnose cancer will have better tools at his disposal and will be more productive and be more accurate and more productive in terms of the number of patients he can see with the tools of artificial intelligence, rather than saying the robot is going to do the diagnosis and the doctor is no longer needed. I think it's the same with driving. I think we will get more and more assisted driving. We already are getting that. You know, it helps you park the car, it tells you when you're about to run into something, and so on. But it doesn't displace you. And I think this dream of the completely driverless car is probably a lot further off than we think, and a lot less practical than we think. But the dream of a very well assisted driving experience, whereby you really don't have an accident because it helps prevent that, is much more nearby. So I think you know, back in 1960, there was a big scare in America that automation was going to cause mass unemployment. It was one of the themes that John F. Kennedy said he was going to tackle in his, if he became president. He was going to make sure that we didn't all lose our jobs to machines. Well, it turned out that we had lots of automation in factories and everything else, and the number of jobs in the economy went up, not down. Whole new professions like software engineer became quite common, whereas they weren't before.
Let's make just a short stop here, because it's very, very interesting, and it's important at least to point this. When we speak about artificial intelligence, AI, there are people who are very, how to say, optimistic and very happy, and they are seeing this like a kind of savior, to say so. On the other hand, there are people who are very skeptical and are actually afraid about artificial intelligence. But I think you mentioned driverless cars. It's important to point this. Ethics will have to play a very important role here. And from this point of view, do you think that ethics can slow down the innovation?
It can do. I hope it won't. I hope that we remember that it's the most ethical thing you can do often is to replace an old bad technology with a new good technology. That it is also ethical to innovate. If you think, you know, the development of a vaccine for malaria, for example, to stand in the way of that development would be unethical. So we have to remember the importance of the ethics of allowing innovation as part of it. And that applies to artificial intelligence too, I think. So we shouldn't just think of ethics as something that cautiously holds back innovation. We should think of ethics as something that sometimes says, please press on with this innovation because you will get rid of a real harm in the world that is causing inequality or misery or depression or something like that. And so, so ethics cuts both ways, I think. But you are, of course, right that we mustn't simply say anything AI does is fine, and even if it decides to reorder our society in a way that it thinks is a good way, that must be okay. Of course not. Just to give you a sort of ridiculous example, if we asked artificial intelligence to tell us how we prevent crime, it would quickly come back and say, I've thought of a brilliant way of preventing crime. Lock all young men up for 10 years between the ages of 18 and 28.
Just to
prevent. You will reduce the crime rate enormously. And you would. It would work. It would have a big effect. But of course, it's not ethical to do that.
And it's not realistic.
So we have to tell, it's not realistic. We have to tell the computer that, sorry, that's not ethical. And we've actually, I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but we've actually had some examples already where forms of racial or sexual discrimination have, as it were, occurred to AIs, and we've had to tell them, no, sorry, that's not something we do.
Yeah. On the other hand, we should not forget that AI learns. So it depends what you teach and how you teach. Yes, because if you teach
Well, it
bad things,
learns, but it doesn't. I think the modern version of AI learns, but not necessarily is taught. So the old version of AI was we're going to teach computers. The new version of AI is we're going to give computers access to the world, and they're going to learn things that we don't know how to teach them. And that is an interesting and to some extent slightly disturbing possibility.
yes, exactly. That we will not have the full control, the total control.
Well, I write in the book about the game of Go and the extraordinary achievement by DeepMind in enabling a computer to learn how to defeat the world champion at this very complicated game. And in that case, we don't know how the computer learned. We know that it learned to be very good at the game, but it didn't. I mean, we taught it the rules, and then it went off and figured out strategies that we human beings had not figured out.
Okay, and is this the point we should be worried about ourselves, about our capacities, about our brain, who is actually not fully understand?
Well, we certainly don't understand our own brains. That's true. But the one that I'm generally not so worried about is the idea of a malevolent computer deciding to destroy us. It's been a fantasy of science fiction for a very, very long time. And we should remember that the film 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, which had HAL in it, the computer that takes revenge on human beings for trying to unplug it. That film came out in 1969, and it was set in the year 2001. And we're now in 2021, and we've never had anything like as bad as that. So I think that's a permanent fiction, but it may never be a fact.
Yes. Okay. I'm looking at the at the time. The time is running. There are a lot of things we can discuss. So let's just remind the people who are watching us, the listeners. This is again a very generous book, a very interesting one. 12 chapters. You go from energy to public health, transportation, food, innovation, low tech, communication and computers, prehistoric innovation. So what is the most important moment in the prehistorian evolution of innovation?
Well, I talk about the innovations that happened a very long time ago. The dog was an innovation. Whether the dog took the initiative, the wolf took the initiative, or the human took the initiative, we don't know. But between them, they innovated a genetic adaptation of the dog that was useful to human beings and vice versa. And I'm deliberately trying to take an example there of something that, you don't think of as an innovation, but it was. And it probably came about by a somewhat similar process, albeit much more slowly than we do innovation today. I then talk about the invention of stone tools, which is at least 100,000 years ago. Well, that's modern stone technology. Older stone technology goes back millions of years. And in fact, I then do something rather strange and talk about the innovation that is the origin of life itself. There was no human being around, obviously. There was no intelligence. It was an emergent phenomenon in the early oceans on the planet, 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. But in a sense, it was the same sort of process of trial and error and gradual capturing of energy to produce useful results that we talk about when we invent new machines. I think a Martian looking at this planet and the history of this planet would see evolution of biological creatures and innovation of technology as a continuum. The cars and buildings that humans produce are an expression of their evolutionary abilities, and it's a very similar process. So I draw close parallels between evolution and innovation.
And then in the chapter, in the 8th chapter, Innovation's Essentials. At least let's point these steps, because these are very interesting and very important, and some of them are very surprisingly to say so, because at a certain point you say that innovation means to use less resources, not more resources, which is something that I don't know if all people will think just like this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We tend to we go around saying we cannot have infinite economic growth on a finite planet. David Attenborough often says this, for example. And I think that's wrong, because growth consists of using less of something quite often. It consists of producing more from less, more energy from less fuel, more food from less land, more machines from less metal, and so on. And this is really happening. It's happening all the time. We use 13% as much metal in a drinks can today as when drinks cans were first invented. We use 68% less land to produce a given quantity of food than we did 50 years ago. So we're actually feeding 7.5 billion people from roughly the same land area that we needed to feed 3 billion people. So actually, when you get to the point that you have invented everything and you've used every resource on the planet, innovation is still possible, because you can do something with half as much material. You can invent an LED light bulb that uses 10 or 15% as much electricity as a previous incandescent light bulb, and so on. I think, and indeed, the statistics suggest that some advanced countries, including America, are now using less stuff than they did before. Not less per head, less overall, totally less. That's despite the fact that their populations are still growing, that their economies are still growing. If you add up all of their imports of raw materials and all of their production from mines and oil wells and so on of materials, you find that it's going down every year. And yet people have higher living standards, and there are more people to have those living standards. So I think it's very important to see innovation as a source of sustainability in the world rather than a problem for sustainability.
Yes, this is something we should, think about it more deeply. Also, innovation is different from invention. And this is, again, something we should keep in mind. And we cannot say, of course, innovation without invention cannot exist, I assume. No?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, invention means coming up with a completely new device. And that's important. You can't have innovation without that. But it's only a very small part of innovation, because the rest of innovation consists of improving that device so as to make it more affordable, more reliable, more available to people. And that's just as difficult, probably more difficult than coming up with a new device in the first place. So if you look at the history of something like the computer, what counts is not the invention of the computer. You know, one day there was no computers and then the next day there was a computer. What counts is the gradual improvement of the first primitive computers and continuing gradual improvement. We describe this as Moore's law, because Gordon Moore described the extraordinary improvement in the function of transistors over time. But despite describing that gradual process, he we weren't able to defeat it, to cheat it, to jump ahead, to develop the best computer. You know, we could have. Why didn't we invent computers like we have today in 1960? Because we had to work our way through these other technologies to get to them. And that's the process that I call innovation as opposed to invention, that it's gradual improvement in technologies, often done by people whose names we don't know, often done in business rather than in universities. Sort of to some extent, I want to rescue that process and give it more of a reputation than it's had in the past.
Yeah, and these are, how to say, all those people are so important. You have to be stubborn. An inventor is a guy who is very curious, of course, but it has, it also has to be stubborn. Yeah, to look for this. An inventor,
very stubborn.
a very stubborn one. An innovator can also be seen like this, because you want to try, you want to see if there is something more. So you have to go for this. It's very interesting. Okay, we touched a little bit the the next chapter, the economics of innovation, and here again is a subchapter that you in which you write that big companies are bad at innovation, and maybe the public perception is on the contrary. Look at the pharma industry, pharmaceutical companies who are investing so much money in research. So how come that innovation is bad with big companies?
Well, pharmaceutical companies do invest a lot in research, but they have been unable to produce new drugs, new vaccines, new medical devices to the same extent as they would like. And in recent years in particular, they have done a lot of their innovation by buying in small startup companies, particularly in biotechnology, for example. So actually the way they do innovation is by getting ideas from other people and purchasing them, as it were. Not entirely, but to a large extent. And if you look at the way big companies operate, they often become very bureaucratic, very centralized, very top-down in their organization. And that does not make it easy for a guy with a new idea to find a place, particularly if his new idea threatens the jobs of some of his colleagues in the big business. So, for example, there was a man working in the Kodak company who did some experiments to show that digital photography was possible, that you could actually make a digital photograph. You weren't going to need film in the future. But his technology was so primitive that nobody felt threatened by it. And the company was so committed to film, and so many of its employees were working on film, that they didn't develop it. And they didn't stop and think, yes, but somebody else outside this company is going to develop this technology, and it's going to get so big that one day there will be no market for our film. And Kodak disappeared altogether. Yeah. Something similar happened to Nokia, which was a very innovative company in the 1990s, became the dominant mobile telephone company in the world by being very nimble and innovative and coming up with new technologies for mobile telephony, making mobile phones very advanced and helpful. And then along comes the rival technology of using mobile phones for data rather than for voice. And Nokia says, no, nobody's going to be interested in that. And we're such a big company, we're going to take a long time to take a decision about whether to invest in that. And it got completely blindsided by the smartphone revolution and was blown out of the water. Yeah. So, something that even in our lifetime was a very innovative company became too big to be an innovative company in the future.
Yeah, so you have to be innovative, but you also have to be visionary, because you gave the example of data. Who will use the data? Everybody wants today to have access to data, to use the data.
And small companies are better at innovation, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay.
It's good.
fakes, frauds, fads, and failures in chapter number 10. And you give here a very, how to say, well-known examples. Amazon, Google, you touched in the beginning. Then chapter 11, resistance to innovation. And we find out from this chapter that novelty can be subversive. The coffee example, the case of coffee. How come?
I think coffee is the best example of it. It's an extraordinary story. I got onto it by reading a book by a wonderful friend of mine called Kalestas Juma, which described how coffee was resisted when it first came into Europe. And I didn't really believe this. So I went off and researched it myself and looked up some of the sources. And it's entirely true that whenever coffee appeared in the 1500s, in first of all Arabia and then in Europe from Africa, it was very popular with people, but very unpopular with kings and rulers generally. Because, well, two main reasons. The first reason was because there were rival industries that campaigned against it. So the wine and beer industry paid for research by the medical profession to prove that coffee was dangerous to people, so that people would stop going to coffee bars and go to beer bars instead, whatever the word for beer bar, pubs instead. The other source of the opposition to coffee, which was extreme, I mean, coffee was banned again and again and again. The other source was because people went to coffee houses to drink coffee, because grinding up the beans was something that you needed machines to do, so people did it. People would go to coffee houses to drink coffee, and when they went to coffee houses, they met their friends, and when they met their friends, they had conversations. And when they had conversations, sometimes the conversations were about whether or not the king was doing a good job, and sometimes they concluded that he was not doing a good job, and this was unacceptable to the king. So the explicit reasons for banning coffee houses was often, and coffee generally, was to stop people spreading fake news about the king. King Charles II in England is very explicit about this in the 1670s when he bans coffee houses. He says, I'm doing this because people are having conversations about whether or not I am doing a good job, and this is unacceptable. Fake news is being spread in coffee houses.
So fake news even that time, not only today. This is not novelty. Okay, coffee is the best drink in the world. After that comes beer and wine. In my personal opinion.
I'm not sure. I'm not as big a coffee fan as that. My wife would agree with you, but I don't think.
Wow. Yes. Coffee first. So then, innovation can be delayed because it can also be demonized. And you have the case of biotechnology. And this is, again, a very interesting case and a very eloquent one and a very paradoxical one, because people are scared when we are talking about biotechnology in food, for example, but we are very okay about drugs who are produced using biotechnology. So how come?
Yes, I have no time for somebody who is happy to be vaccinated with a genetically engineered messenger RNA vaccine made by Pfizer, and then goes out campaigning against genetic engineering of crops. It is completely hypocritical, I think. The biotechnology in agriculture is a terrifying example of a very promising technology which an entire continent decided it didn't want. And it decided so for very bad reasons. The continent is Europe, and the reasons were because there were possible health or environmental impacts from genetically modified crops that would be worse than the chemical industries, the chemical agriculture that is being used today. It's very clear from South America and North America and parts of Asia that this is not true. That if we had adopted genetically modified crops in Europe, we would now be using fewer chemicals in agriculture, our food would be safer, our farmers would be safer, and our environment would be better, and our wildlife would have thrived. So I'm actually very militant on this subject. I think it's a good example of resistance to technology can be very dangerous. That doesn't mean that we have to accept, that we can't be suspicious of new technologies. There are technologies that can do harm, and we do have to be cautious and find a way to gain public acceptance. But it reminds us that while we keep telling ourselves we're in favor of innovation, quite a lot of the time we're not. I mean, you could have made just as good an argument that mobile telephones might be dangerous. They might cause problems in people's brains, give us cancer in our heads or something, 40 years ago. And yet we decided, no, these are too useful. We want them. We're not. You can't scare me about that. Well, because it was too useful a product. And the problem with genetically modified crops is that the first generation were useful to farmers, but not to consumers. And so it was very easy to resist them.
Yes, but maybe this is our, our European ego. We know better than the others that biotechnology is not good for us, it's good for others. Anyway, detailed in your details in your book, there is only one stop I would like to make to take on in this chapter about the mobile telephony, which you said that when government prevents innovation, and this might be so, surprising. Mobile telephony. What government would prevent mobile telephony?
I'm struggling to remember. Oh, yes, I can remember what you're talking about in my book. I'd forgotten for a second. Yes, this is an extraordinary story that the allocation of spectrum, electromagnetic spectrum, to the cell phone concept was talked about in the 1940s and then prevented for 40 years after that. And the television companies owned large chunks of the spectrum and didn't use most of it. So it would have been very easy to say, no, you can have this. But the idea that you could dramatically improve radio communication between people by having them communicate with a nearby tower, which then communicated by underground with another nearby tower where your friend was, who you wanted to talk to. And that way you would be able to have millions of people having conversations at once. That idea is out there in the 1940s. And yet it's not until the 1990s that it takes off, when spectrum is allocated to cellular. So government, by being lobbied by the television industry not to release the spectrum to a rival, actually stood in the way of that technology. Now, that's a very American way of seeing that story. And I've said to Tom Hazlitt, who's written the key book on this, well, why didn't another continent say, okay, we're going to do it differently? And he said, because in all the other continents, telephony was effectively so nationalized and monopolized that there was nobody even trying to invent cellular telephony.
Yes, this is very, very indeed interesting how these things happen. The last stop is the last chapter, an innovation famine. And it's, again, surprisingly, how can you talk about famine when you talk about innovation? Are we did we reach our bottom of innovation?
Well, I think if you look at the Western world in particular, you are seeing slowing rates of innovation. You're seeing less turnover of companies. You're seeing longer lifespan of companies. You're seeing fewer startups. You're seeing lots of technologies that simply aren't changing very much anymore. You're seeing more resistance to technology, like we talked about with biotechnology. So I don't think we live in an age of spectacular technological change the way we sort of think we do. we are deceived in that by what's happening in the digital world, by the fact that you can start a new social media app or something like that very, very quickly. But in the real world, if you want to invent a vaccine or a medical device or a new form of transportation, or a different design plane, it's really very difficult today. There are huge incumbent companies with vested interests. There are big regulatory hurdles and delays. And actually, compared with my grandparents who lived through, who were born before the motor car and the aeroplane and ended with man on the moon and supersonic jets in the air, I don't think I've lived through changes as dramatic as that. Sure, I've had Netflix come along in my lifetime and Facebook and Amazon, but Amazon is just an update on the Sears catalog of 100 years ago, as somebody pointed out recently.
That's true. So, but still, we have to, we don't have to take for granted. We have to nurture innovation. We have to take care of innovators. We have to give the freedom, like you said in your book. Yes, because it's one of the most important ingredients, the freedom of thinking, of moving, the political freedom. You have China in your book, so it's not the main ingredient, but it's an important one.
No, I mean, I'm in favor of political freedom. I'm not a fan of the Chinese regime, but China has shown that as long as there's economic freedom, you will get innovation, even if you don't have full political freedom. But I think in the end, it's a compromise that can't last.
Regulations, how necessary are, or deregulations?
Well, regulation is very important because it makes technology safer. It's also very important because sometimes it makes technology more innovative. There's a good example I give in the book of the Clinton administration passing a series of laws in the 1990s to enable e-commerce to begin, to enable online commercial activity to get going. Now, these were very deliberately libertarian rules that were passed, saying, yes, you can go online and start a business and do this, that, and the other, and you are not going to be subject to some of the same restrictions and constrictions that you would do if you were not online. So that's a good example of regulation designed to encourage rather than discourage innovation. But it's surprisingly scarce. Quite often, regulation does have the effect of discouraging innovation, which is a pity.
So, Matt Ridley, thank you so much. To conclude, do we learn 100%? Are we out of any questions when we read your book, how innovation works? Do we find everything about how innovation works?
No. Well, I start the book by saying innovation is rather a mysterious process. By the end of the book, I hope I have made it a little less mysterious, but I don't think it's a surprisingly poorly understood phenomenon, given how important it is.
But it appeared that you had a lot of fun writing this book.
I really enjoyed it. I loved telling the stories of innovators. I suddenly had an idea that I wanted to write the book in the form of stories of how people changed the world, followed by the lessons from those stories, rather than the other way around. We tend to think, I'm going to sit down and write my argument and I'm going to support it with examples. Let's just have all the examples up front as stories, as narratives, and then see what themes emerge. And that actually was a wonderful way of writing a book. It was a different way for me of writing a book. I'm sure. And I'm really thrilled that it's been translated into Romanian.
Yes, I'm very happy to. The readers will be very, very happy to. How long did it take you to write this book?
About a year. I find if I take longer than a year to write a book, I forget what I've said in the first chapter.
the first chapter is here in this, again, in this book, so the readers should take it a very how to say, easy to read book, even if it's so filled with a lot of examples, very well known. And maybe this is how to say, this is the way to write serious and important things, given the examples that we are used with. Everybody knows about Amazon, about a lot of other things you are talking about in this book. And maybe this is a, how to say, an encouragement for people to let the imagination run. And kids, like you said, we have to encourage young generations for this.
Absolutely, the most important thing.
Thank you so much again. And we are waiting for you to come to Romania, and we are waiting for the next book.
Thank you, Corina, for a very enjoyable interview. It's been most entertaining, and look forward to meeting you in Romania one day.
Thank you very much again.